This is going to be a discussion that's been inspired by a book that I'm currently reading. The name of the book is War and Human Civilization by Azar Gat. There's the book. So you have a nice cover that has, it looks like a Neo-Assyrian army, I'm going to guess under Sennacherib, and that's probably the siege of Jerusalem if I'm not mistaken. This Azar Gat is apparently an Israeli academic. I've come across his name several times. He's cited as kind of an authoritative theorist when it comes to the history of human warfare. He has several very well received books, and I'd had this book for a while now, and after coming across his name subsequently in research on the internet, I kept thinking, well, I've got it there on my shelf. So after I finished the book on the Great Wall, I picked this book up, and it promises to be quite a tour de force. He begins just with aggression between animals, interspecies killing, among all types of animals, and I mean the first 6 chapters we're still in like evolutionary stages of human psychology. The later chapters deal with the rise of the state, the rise of capitalism, superpowers, terrorism. I think that I very well could end up doing multiple videos inspired by this book. As far as I can tell, he's certainly not a libertarian, but that does not mean that he's not worth looking at. So what I found very interesting is he approaches what I like to relay here is he talks about is human aggression an ingrained natural thing? And of course there's this very long nature-nurture debate that's been kind of perpetual. And it is actually interesting. He does briefly talk about behaviorism and Skinner, and how the idea that people are tabula rasa, they're blank slates that that we can impute to act any way we like, is a fetish from the 1930s that nobody, including in the behavioral sciences, believes any longer, which is yet more confirmation of kind of a pet peeve of mine and many of my subscribers I know as well, that there's a certain internet cult that fancies itself to be New Age and free thinking, that is essentially several antiquated fad ideas from the 1930s, communist ideas, utopian communism that's spurned by the New Deal, that have become somehow modern because people are too dumb to know the past. But I thought that was interesting. But his approach to this question was I thought very, very good. Is human aggression natural? Is it learned? And the short answer is yes. Humans have the capacity for aggression, for violence, and indeed they have the capacity for all the violence that we have witnessed, that history is a testament to. But he also makes a very interesting point. It's not a requirement for us to flourish. There are many people, in fact probably most people today, who will live their entire lives and never commit an aggressive act that comes anywhere close to war anyway. I mean, maybe you get in a fist fight, maybe you yell at somebody, maybe you act threatening, but the chances that you don't have to go and commit homicide to survive, and most people don't. But what he does say is we have inherent genetic traits that don't get activated except under certain external stimuli. And of course the kind of the cliched example is abused children. If you have a child who is abused in their youth, this essentially activates its traits. It's similar to people becoming very muscular. Can we naturally become bodybuilders? Well, it's within our ability to do so. We have it within our genes to become, extremely muscularized, low-fat, supermen essentially. But that requires the application of some type of external stimuli. And in the case of that, weightlifting, raising your metabolism, that sort of thing. So within all of us are the genes to become extraordinarily aggressive, as aggressive as anybody essentially. Today, most people don't have those activated, although I don't think that it has to happen when you're young. in fiction, if we watch a show, and I haven't actually watched this, but I'm finding it irresistible, The Walking Dead, if we put people in a suddenly very violent situation, they will probably adapt, and the latent traits that allow them to be aggressive and violent will manifest themselves, whereas they didn't previously. I think also militaries around the world probably have systematized and worked this out to a science. The entire point probably of military training is to get people to activate these traits of people. So you can take a sedentary, peaceful population like we have in the West, like we have in the United States, take people who have not been activated for aggression, activate that through external stimuli, and get them to become more aggressive and more prone to war. Now, the other very interesting things is when he discusses the selective processes that would bring this about. Fascinating stuff. He goes into a lot of discussions of anthropology, of hunter-gatherers, of horticultural society, of early agrarian societies. I'm still not to the Neolithic Revolution in terms of where he is. That I expect that to be very interesting as well. I could already see how there are some very significant and interesting differences between 99.5% of human history and how we live in the West today, which maybe I'll touch on at the end. But there's kind of been a lot of people have said, look, there's only so much we can learn by studying contemporary or nearly contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. The most famous examples today are like the Ikung and the Bushmen in Africa and Tanzania, and the Hazda in Tanzania, and the Ikun in the Kalahari, and then slightly farther back, the Bushmen and Aborigines in Australia, and those in Papua New Guinea, and we go back to the 19th, 18th century in America, in North America, and actually in South America still among Amazonian tribes. The one that he cites the most is Yamamano, I think because they're the most studied. One thing a lot of anthropologists have pointed out is that, look, all the societies that still exist today, they exist because they live on marginal land that is not sufficient for agriculture. So there's never been agriculture in, the central basin of Australia because it's far too arid, and it's not a very productive area. Now, it's an open question then, what would hunter-gatherers be like in an area that is significantly more productive, say in the Fertile Crescent, in the Nile River Valley, in the Yangtze, or in Southeast Asia? A lot of people have speculated that we can't learn about hunter-gatherer societies generally because the only ones we can really study are ones that are on marginal land. He points out that this isn't entirely true. We do have examples of hunter-gatherer societies, or at least horticulturist hunter-gatherer societies, in areas of high productivity, most importantly in the northeast of Australia and what is today Queensland, and even more importantly in the northwest of the United States and British Columbia. That is an area with very high calorie availability thanks to the salmon runs and the profusion of wildlife on land. There's a lot of resources available there for hunter-gatherers, enough to support agricultural type societies in terms of their scope. And we have studied those. I mean, they're not gone. They're not there any longer, but that we had first contact. We had people now, what's interesting then is the aggressiveness is necessary. All right, if people were completely pacifistic and incapable of aggression, then none of us would be here today. We'd all be dead, because the minute a predator or another person approached them and threatened their life or their resource base, so indirectly threatening their lives, if they were unable to have an aggressive response, then they would be marginalized, if not directly killed. That's not to say everyone has to be violent all the time. Indeed, there are costs to that as well that make it undesirable, which is why we're not inherently always violent. It's something that we need in competitive situations. And he goes into a lot of discussion of how kind of the nature of that competition through the large course of human history. Hunter-gatherer societies were every human up until the Neolithic Revolution, and most of humanity, a declining proportion of humanity from the Neolithic Revolution up until now. There's still some people who live this way. True hunter-gatherers today are exceptionally rare, but 5,000 years ago it wasn't that uncommon. 10,000 years ago it was essentially everybody. And 10,000 years ago, it depends on the date you want to put to the evolution of true humans. Anatomically modern ones, you're going back 150, 200,000 years ago. There's indications that there was some kind of leap in evolution in the Upper Paleolithic. When we start getting the rock art, there's certainly an explosion of indications of sophistication anyway in terms of the toolkit around that time. We don't know if that was a cultural thing, if that was an evolutionary thing. That remains to be seen. But all through the Mesolithic, still hunter-gatherers, and it's not until, like I said, the introduction of agricultural at the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution that things start to actually change. But people kind of say, well, the competition that's going to be for food resources. But as long as there's plenty of resources, then there shouldn't be a lot of competition. But the thing that people compete for the most is not food or resources, it's females. It's women. That's actually, in a very interesting way, it's not a limited resource or finite resource in the sense that there's a set supply, but the demand always exceeds the supply. In like laboratory conditions, in totally natural conditions, the birth rates are not equal. For every 100 women born, about 105 boys will be born. And I don't know why that is. That's just the truth. But historically, the difference in the ratio is actually much greater than that. Female infanticide has been very widespread, and it's famous for happening in China, but all the anthropological evidence is that hunter-gatherer societies, ones that we know contemporaneously and through looking through physical remains, was very high. And the reason for this is simple. There's a certain logic to spreading one's genes. For a man, he can potentially spread almost a huge number of children. He can impregnate numerous females, and he can father dozens, hundreds of children. I think the record that I heard was 600 children. It's obviously somebody with a harem. There could actually be people who have more that we don't know, but dozens or hundreds certainly possible. That happens today. I mean, there are Mormons who have polygamous families, and they have dozens and dozens and dozens of children. Women can't do this. Women, if they're very lucky, if they are very healthy, in a modern society, max out around 20. That's probably the most that they can, maybe 21, maybe 22. That's, in historical times, that would be almost impossible. The most dangerous thing a woman can do without modern medicine is give birth, essentially. And maternal fatalities from childbearing would have been very high, to the point where a woman really should not expect to have more than 5 to 10 would be very good, historically. And sometimes much less than this. Whereas a man obviously could have 10 times that number. So from the thing though with the woman, what's interesting is women, because women don't want to be, for a man, he just wants to go and spread his seed and then let the children go. The woman doesn't want this, because raising a child is very difficult. Human children take a lot of resources and a lot of time to be reared. Women doesn't want to do that alone, and she wants to have the man be there. Also, it's necessary for the man to, without modern testing for paternity, for the man to have any kind of assurance that the children are actually his and he's not just getting cuckolded all the time. Monogamy makes a lot of sense. Women, basically, since they control to a large degree, they don't. Men cannot tell when, and this relates to, men can't tell when women are ovulating or not. So they actually have a lot of control over what gets fertilized and what doesn't. Not 100%, but enough for it to matter. So normally you're going to have slightly more men than you're going to have women. In hunter-gatherer society, since having a man gives you a better chance of fathering some children, or perhaps a lot, females were discriminated against during infanticide, and the ratios that we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies aren't 100 births of girls to 100 births of men. It's 100 births of girls to 120, 130 births of boys. In extreme examples, he cites the Eskimos. There were times when it was literally coming to 2/3 were male. 2/3 of the surviving offspring were boys. Now, this leads to an obvious kind of very, very touchy game of musical chairs where there are more guys than there are girls. And this means that the women can be selective. If they get to pick, they're not going to pick the guys who are the least competitive, who are the weakest, who are the least able to serve them. They're going to pick the guys who are the best, able to provide, the most competitive. And so they do. But what's more than that is the men still want to have as many kids as possible. They would like to have multiple female partners. This implies polygamy, but this is difficult because there's a man who wants every woman. And so for you to get multiple women, you have to outcompete the monogamous males who are going to be available for that woman. And this is why Roman Skasku, a YouTuber, interesting guy, was mentioning to me that look, it's not just about wealth. It's not just about having enough to live. People want status. They want power. They want to be able to, not in absolute terms be okay. They want to be, in relative terms, be better off than their neighbors. This is actually a very well-known phenomenon where people don't gauge their wealth in any like I have everything I need. It's, am I richer than everyone around me? And there's a very clear reason for this. If you have status and wealth and power relative to your neighbors and you're a man, then you can have polygamy. You can have more wives. You know, why should she leave her monogamous relationship to go for you? Well, if you're richer and more powerful, that's a good reason. And so the competition isn't just to find resources, it's to acquire status and dominance. And that dominance, by the way, is very sophisticated in humans. Part of it is physical power, but other parts of it is just political acumen. If you're socially able to manipulate or offer yourself as a very useful mediator or something like that, arbitrator, that can do it. If you look particularly good, if you're particularly healthy, if you have a big dick, I mean, and that sounds like a joke, but it's really not, because human females have human penises, slight tangent here. Human penises are way too big to be necessary for procreation, and they're way bigger than the great, relatively speaking, to the other great apes. They are clearly getting selected for by females. Why? Why do females like big dicks? I don't know. I know, well, different story. But there's a whole basket of traits that are getting selected for. And what he talks about, it's quite interesting. The potential rewards for the individual men with the highest status are incredible in terms of evolution, because they can end up siring many times more children. So, you know, the average hunter-gatherer who's monogamous, 2-3 kids, maybe 5. If he's super lucky, 10, you know, that would be very, very rare. He has 3 wives, suddenly he's going to have at least 10 probably. Very likely could have 20 or 30. He gives one example of a guy in a Yamamaro tribe who had, before he died, he had over 450 descendants, let's just say that, between his kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. And I know if you read like about Pocahontas, you know, her father was the king of the Powhatan. He had 12 wives and he had 100 children. Whereas your average, and here's the thing is, we're playing this game of hot potatoes, you know, that means that the guys who are the least successful aren't getting married to anybody, and their chances of siring a kid doesn't go to 0, but it goes way down, and maybe they'll sneak one in here or there. Maybe you've got a Casanova who's super slick in bed, and he's able to, you know, occasionally sire them, but the person with the most status and power has the opportunity to have more wives and more. And this is actually something that you see not just in hunter-gatherers, but most of these agricultural societies. If we look in Mesopotamia and Sumer and Akkad, if we look in the Mormon communities today, Mormon communities today, it's the most powerful men get all the wives, and then the other men, a lot of them end up with nothing. And so in terms of evolution, those more powerful men are 100% winners. But what's interesting here is, at this point in time, if you're alive today, your patrilineal line is going to go through men like this for probably 100,000 years. Like, you are descended from those guys, because everybody is at this point. You know, the joke is Genghis Khan, 2% of the population. That is a little bit unusual because that's not in hunter-gatherer society. That's in agricultural. Well, he was a pastoralist society, but same difference. And then, by the way, this is something that I think is different, because right now the most powerful, prestigious people don't have more kids. So this is something that's different in the West. It's different in modern times. Polygamy wasn't as widespread, even if we go back, into the Neolithic Revolution. He hasn't talked about that yet, but I just know that, again, it was the elites. There are exceptions. Chinese emperors, Ottoman sultans had big harems, and they would have had a lot of kids. But today it doesn't really happen that much, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, you have the most competitive, in a broad sense, guys fathering the most children. And you do that for 1,000,000 years, or 100,000 years, or even 10,000 years, everybody's going to be coming from one of those lines. There's also, I think, and I've heard this reference one other time, somewhere in, because it is like evolutionary musical chairs, where there's going to be more guys than there are women, and there's going to be obviously a few at the top with the most status and the most power who are going to win. They're going to have the most. You're going to have a lot of other people who manage monogamy, and then you're going to have the people at the bottom who aren't able to reproduce, or reproduce very little. And so you end up with all these guys who can't have a girl, who can't be paired with a woman. I think that somewhere in there it would be highly likely that homosexuality is to be found. I can't say that for sure. I don't know how it would be transmitted, but there are, your genes don't only go through your kids. Your gene, because even your kid will only be 50% your genes, but your nieces and nephews, they have your genes too. And your, second cousins and all them, they all have your genes as well. And he talks about this as well, the idea of tribe, clan, family group. It makes sense from an evolutionary point of view to keep the spread of your like genes, and so you're going to help your nieces and nephews and your cousins. And also this affects attraction, because you'll be attracted to people who share your genes. If someone is 100% different from you genetically, then the best you can hope for is that 50% of your kids will be yours. If the person is 75% like you already, then it's going to be 50% from you, but some of the genes from the other person are yours already, and so the offspring will actually be more. And that's actually probably why there's a strong amount of attraction towards people who look similar, because they probably have similar genes. Not 100%, but that's in there as well. And there's at some point it's very hard to tell who your third cousins are or whatever, but that's what culture kind of comes in. Is it kind of ends, okay, if they have a different accent, they look different, they have a different culture, then they're probably not really related to me. And so I can, in competition, taking from them is good for me. And this is where war comes out. The other interesting thing is, it seems like the acquisition of females, or disputes over females, is one of the, if not the single most common causes belli of warfare. Which goes again with the fact that there's not enough supply of females relative to the demand for males. 1 second. As I pursue a male in a very unhunter-gatherer type situation. Anyway, and actually there's lots of interesting things in this book. He talks about the typical types of violence, and he points out, look, violence does not make sense unless there's an asymmetry of offensive potential. If you are equally strong to somebody else, it does not make sense to fight. And this is where there's kind of this myth that primitive warfare was ritualistic, because when you had like two groups of guys come face each other in a field, it tended to be ritualistic, like dance, blah, blah, blah. And people think that's what all war was like. But that's only because in that situation, a direct conflict, a melee between them all would be extremely dangerous, and of course not in either of their interests. But most primitive warfare is you sneak in the camp in the middle of the night and you kill all the men and the boys in their sleep or before they have time to really act, and then you abduct all the women and procreate with them. That's how it usually goes, and the attrition and the lethality is very, very high, to the point of wiping out entire tribes or whatever. But he said one of the most common ways they would do it, though, would be through subterfuge, where they would offer a wedding, and during the wedding, they would, kind of spread throughout the village or whatever, and at the sign of the chief, kill all their enemies. And I was like, this is so Game of Thrones, it's not even funny, but maybe that's what J.R.R. Martin was talking about when he wrote that chapter. But that is the kind of the typical warfare. You want to have an asymmetry in power, and this is again an interesting difference in the West, because there's a couple things you can see. Part of this is why I think that there's this tradition of you don't kill the women, because that's ultimately what everyone's fighting for. Genetically speaking, evolutionary speaking, except for some of us, that's what everybody's looking for. It's interesting in the West where there became this, okay, we're going to have the two armies fight each other. That is very unusual historically. I'm sure he'll get to that, because that seems like a really obvious thing to address. I'm curious to see what he says. I'm sure it has something to do with states and agriculture. Let's see, there's a couple other, he talks about modern feminism and how that's, what all that implies. He talks about just the natural, more bellicose, more aggressive nature of men. They're more willing to engage in violence than women. Not that women are unable, but there's a remarkable dimorphism when we come to this. They study any homicide anywhere, it's primarily men. 90% plus, easily, everywhere. It could be Detroit, it could be London, it could be Vienna or Minsk, or the Hazda village in Tanzania. It's going to be men killing, not women, 90% of the time. I think his basic conclusion, and I haven't read the conclusion yet, is that it is about competition, ultimately, over resources, but also over status. And that a lot of the wars aren't because they're necessarily starving, although that happens too. It's because they're trying to establish dominance over an increasing body of females, which will allow rewards, genetic evolutionary rewards, to the winners, to the competitive winners. Very fascinating. It is interesting, the idea that we all have within us, men, not women, basically a killer, a person whose forefathers, with almost 100 degree of certainty, were the big men throughout history, because that was who was procreating the most. That's who's been producing the most children up until the Neolithic Revolution, and even beyond then, for up until very recently. So pat yourself on the back. He talks about that too. It was a very interesting book. I highly recommend it. It's not particularly libertarian, but it's very, very informative, very interesting, very thought-provoking. He includes a lot of very interesting pictures, cave art that might depict battles, open to some interpretation, but still very, very evocative. It's also a great survey. He's talking about the Aborigines. He's talking about the Aztec. He's talking about the Sioux Indians. He's talking, you'll learn a little bit about a lot, and a lot about this particular topic. And what is more central to world history than war? I mean, history is essentially a history of war, and to understand it better, I think, is well worth the effort for any who choose to do it. So, anyway, this has already been a pretty long video. I apologize for that, but I am quite positive that before I finish this, I'll have to make several other videos about other stages in the cultural development of war. So I didn't want to wait, because obviously it would be even longer then. So, all right, I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop.